Good afternoon. I'm Josh Garrett-Davis. I'm the Gamble Associate Curator of Western History, Popular Culture, and Firearms here at the Autry Museum of the American West. And I want to start by acknowledging right here at the museum that we are on the homelands of the Tongva Gabrielino people, who are the traditional caretakers and owners of this land. I also want to thank the Autry's generous donors and members for making this program and this series happen. And I'm honored, along with the Autry trustees and staff, to welcome you to the Autry Artist Salons. And this one is on an illustrated California history that we'll talk about, and the general topic of the historical imagination, which we'll get more into. I also want to note that it's sort of a momentous day here at the museum. We celebrated this morning the history-making career of our retiring president and CEO, Rick West, who came out of his first retirement from founding the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian to lead the Autry for the past near decade. And as of about the end of this program, it will be 5 o'clock. And so hopefully he's well on his way to enjoying much more time with those adorable grandkids, and as well as serving as our ambassador to Native communities still going into the future. And tomorrow we welcome our new CEO, Steve Aaron, who has worked at and with the Autry for some 20 years, in addition to his work as an esteemed Western historian at UCLA. So I just want to convey both our deep gratitude as an institution for Rick's leadership and our excitement to greet Steve first thing tomorrow morning with open arms. We look forward to this next chapter of leadership. So joining me today are Weshoyot Alvitre, a Tongva Los Angeles Basin comic book, graphic artist and illustrator, and John Mack Faragher, the Howard R. Lamar Professor Emeritus of History and American Studies at Yale University. They are collaborating together on California and American History. It's an illustrated narrative history of California. It's somewhat in the tradition of E.H. Gombrich's A Little History of the World, a long time favorite of many people. And we're going to talk about that and then zoom out to their broader careers and practices, creative and scholarly practices, and the theme of historical imagination. And before we go any further, I want to mention that if you have any questions during our conversation, that you can use the Q&A function in the bottom, if you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window. So just to give a little bit longer bios of Weshoyot and Johnny. Weshoyot Alvitre comes from the San Gabriel Mountains on the property of Satuiwa, a cultural center started by her father, Art Alvitre. She grew up close to the land and was raised with traditional knowledge that inspires the work she does today. For over 15 years in the comics medium, she's made contributions to numerous books, including Umbrella Academy, Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream, and Little Bird. Weshoyot partnered with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian on Native Knowledge 360, a national education initiative to inspire and support teaching about Native Americans using comics. She illustrated 12 pages of sequential comic art, which has been used on their site and as a tool for teachers nationwide, as well as numerous other projects. I've been admiring her work for a few years, and I'm thrilled that she is part of a team of Tongva experts, including her aunt, Cindy Alvitre, who's been schooling many of us at the Autry for some time. And they are helping create a piece in, or a portion of our upcoming court gallery exhibition, Magic West, that we may also get to talk a little bit about because it resonates thematically with this whole conversation. John Mack Faragher was born in Arizona and raised in Southern California. He has had a lifelong interest in the American West, migrations, frontiers, and borders by experience and roots. Trained at Yale by Howard Lamar, and after teaching at Mount Holyoke College for 15 years, Johnny returned to Yale in 1993 and helped create the Lamar Center for the Study of Frontiers and Borders. He is the author of many books on American history, including a biography of Daniel Boone that received a Los Angeles Times Book Prize. I know his work has been influential at the Autry since before the museum opened. I recently learned his first book, Women and Men on the Overland Trail, was read by staff planning the original exhibitions here. And some of you may have seen his most recent appearance at the Autry when his book, Eternity Street, Violence and Justice in Frontier Los Angeles, came out in 2016. He's also, I think, advised the museum on numerous occasions over the decades. And all of that is only the tip of the iceberg for both of these wonderful people who I'm so excited to talk to. Again, if you have any questions during the conversation, the Q&A is at the bottom of the Zoom window. The Autry represents something a little different to each of us who visits physically and virtually, and the personal connection is really central to one of the defining strengths of our institution. And for me, this program perfectly exemplifies what is so special about the Autry, in that we're, in my mind, the kind of the perfect venue to host a conversation. And I'll caricature each of you a little bit, between a sort of cool young indigenous comics artist and an august Ivy League emeritus professor collaborating, because I think the Autry is one of those sites where the archives and the community meet, where we recognize that some of the best work on our places and peoples and pasts happens in indie publishing, and some of it happens in fancy university presses, and everywhere in between. And furthermore, as a parent, the intergenerational nature of this work, as we'll see, is also key, and I think resonates with a lot of what we do at the museum. So thank you, Weshoyot and John, for joining us today. So I wanted to just start off by asking you both to describe this project, California in American History, which is coming out in spring of 2022 from Yale University Press. Can you just give a little background on this particular book, and then we'll zoom out to the bigger themes?
Well, I guess I'll start. I was the instigator of this, so it makes sense. I was offered an opportunity by Yale University Press to write a California history for a general audience, and particularly for young readers, young adult readers, the YA audience, as they call. And the specs for this book was that it would include many narrative chapters, short narrative chapters. It would have no footnotes, no bibliography. And it would give me, the author, the responsibility and the pleasure of working with an illustrator. Now, I have been a practicing historian for, I'm afraid to say, nearly 50 years. And as Josh said, specializing in the history of the American West. And I've published books of social history and biography, and a survey history of the American West, and a survey history, college level survey history textbook for American history. And I've worked with historical images and utilized them in all my work. Now I'm a sort of a purist about it. That is, I want original images. I don't want doctored ones. I want to identify them. I want their provenance. I like to use them as historical evidence. But I have never worked with an illustrator. That'd be the first time that I'd done that. And the design of the book called for 40 half-page illustrations to open each of 40 chapters, and a full-page frontispiece for the book. And I had decided early on that the most prominent through line for me in the narrative history of California would be Native Californians. The book opens pre-conquest, details the history of what Gerald Visenor called survivance over the centuries, and ends with the native fluorescence in the late 20th and 21st century. And so that led me to think that what I really needed was an illustrator with a native background. And so from a former graduate student who works as a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, I received a short list of possible illustrators, and looking at their work online, I was charmed by Weshoyot's style and merely taken with it. And it was my very good fortune that she agreed to work with me. And it's been a collaborative and rewarding relationship for me, I hope for her, and I'll let her talk now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And likewise, it was really an absolute surprise when you contacted me for this project, because I was familiar with one of your books, Eternity Street, which actually references some of my ancestral history, my family line. And so I was a bit taken aback because I was a fan of that book, and I couldn't believe that you contacted me for this project. But to be able to, work with a historian that writes so eloquently about our history, I was also very intimidated because this is a little bit more in the historical context than I'm used to with my projects. So I, of course, had to like backtrack and like, fangirling over the, what a fan I was of your book. But, I asked you if you had a completed manuscript that I could review because automatically I'm going to sensitivity. And while I was familiar with, your work for Eternity Street, I wasn't familiar with your other writings, and I didn't know how this material was going to be handled. And that's something that I always, first and foremost, it doesn't matter who's writing it, I take into consideration with the project. So, Johnny was nice enough to send the manuscript over, and I spent like about 4 days having a robot read me the manuscript because I was on a deadline with another project. So I had this weird robot app that would read it to me. And I finished it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is such a dream to, potentially be involved in, because I'm a huge fan of books in general, and especially older illustrated books. A lot of the books I have in my collection are early 1900s illustration, pen and ink. And just back and forth with talking with Johnny through email, that's kind of the direction he wanted to take it. So I was just, kind of over the moon. It was a dream project, not only to deal with California history, but deal with it with somebody who is, so well versed in the material. And then through a publisher like Yale University Press too is pretty impressive. So I'm really happy to be able to have been chosen for the project and that it went as smoothly as it did.
That's so great. I mean, I think now is probably a good time to bring up a few of the images, if we could, to kind of go through, and maybe we can skip back and forth a little bit if you all want, but and talk about maybe how a few of these came to be, what kinds of research you had to do, what were you thinking about as you sort of composed them? What was your collaborative process? All of that. I would love to hear. Maybe not on every single one, but just to sort of get the flavor of how this came about.
Yeah, of course.
I think it's a really good one to start with here because, pardon me, it illustrates something that I've been thinking a lot about, and that is that original new illustrations specifically for the book have the advantage of rectifying what one might call the colonial gaze. You think about encounter, think about drawings of the encounter. I mean, we've all seen them, right? The John Vandermeer's Columbus landing is in the rotunda of the Capitol. So we all know the stereotype of that image. And here we have a very different kind of encounter image, a different way of visualizing what, a story that we've all grown up hearing. But this is a really important way of decentering the old colonial story and trying to get to include, the people that really matter here, which is the several 100,000 native people of California on the eve of Spanish conquest.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the way that this project was laid out. I mean, Johnny provided me a chapter list, and there was some edits in between, but he was very, very organized, and he provided historical images that had been done on these events for me to reference. And many of them I was familiar with just with my own research, but some of them I wasn't. And he also made it priority that not only were the indigenous representation in those images where it showed Native people, front and center, but also he encouraged me to sort of break that wall in engaging with the audience. So in this image, I think the edit that we did is they were all kind of facing the ships coming in, and he said, what if we put one and it's looking at the audience reading this? It creates another dynamic and it makes it a lot more modern and fresh, because then you're creating a visual dialogue between yourself as a reader, whether you're native or you're non-native, and experiencing what these people experienced with the Spanish ships coming in. And all of these illustrations, they're all half page. They were done quite small, and they're all done in pen and ink with a 18th century Aiken and Lambert pen and ink pen. So I kind of stuck with a method that I had used on a graphic novel too, because I liked the effect, and I wanted these to sort of mimic those old illustrations that you commonly see, but sort of flip them on their head a little bit, considering I'm a Native American and I'm also a female doing these illustrations. oftentimes the illustrators were white men.
Of course, yeah, almost always, yeah, and we're stuck with those. I mean, so this is one of the great, for me, one of the great opportunities of this form of historical imagination is that it allows us to switch the point of view. Now, that it raises in itself other problems that need to be confronted, but it does give that possibility of rectifying the old established view of things. And just to put this in context a little bit, what we're seeing here is an imagined, we imagine ourselves on the beach at San Diego Bay, watching the approach of two Spanish vessels. It's the Cabrillo expedition in 1542. And of course, the standard trope about this kind of an encounter is that these people are stunned. They think gods have arrived. They throw themselves on their prone on the beach and ask for salvation. I have the advantage of having read the accounts, the Spanish accounts. The first thing these people said to the Spanish when they came ashore was, "You must be the people we heard about. You must be the people that our cousins, the Quichans on the Colorado River," because it wasn't the big red river to the east, told us invaded them and killed a lot of people. You must be those people. And Cabrillo knew exactly what they were talking about because he knew about Coronado. So right away, your idea of passivity is gone, right? We have a very different situation here where people are involved in trade networks. They're communicating with their cousins, 100 miles away. And this, every place the Spanish stopped along the Southern California coast, people said, "You must be the people we heard about." So it really is, it's a very different, it puts history in a very different frame. This is one of my favorites because I imagined it long before I had ever discussed it with Weshoyot, because of the description in the record. The description, this is in 15, I'm sorry, what is the date here? 1585. So we're 40 years later. And in the background there, that's a Manila Galleon. So the Spaniards had this trade from Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco. And it was a long Pacific voyage. And many people suffered from scurvy during this voyage. And so they were looking for various places they could stop and resupply. And California was one of them. And so this is a Manila Galleon. It stopped along the California coast to reconnoiter and see if this would be a possible place for a base. And it seems that people think this is Morro Bay. We're not sure exactly, but they think it was at Morro Bay. But these ships were entirely staffed by Filipinos. Filipinos were the crewmen. And in this particular one, there was a small contingent of mestizo Mexican soldiers. And so the account says the soldiers are dressed in chain mail and steel helmets, and the Filipino scouts are in tie-dye loincloths with spears and leather shields. And meanwhile, the Chumash warriors have their own. So this is the first colonial encounter, Filipino and Mexicans against Chumash. You talk about diversity, talk about multicultural. This is the real history of it. It's not the white Spaniards and the Red Indians. It's many Pacific peoples here meeting on the cusp of empire. And I think she's just done a marvelous job of illustrating it. This dancing figure here in the front is taken right from a document that we found that, each of these, you look at a lot of historical images and try to, one of the things about this is there's the question of verisimilitude. How close can you get to being truthful in this? And I think, Weshoyot has gone to great lengths here to make the costuming right and to get things correct in the image, which is an important part of the responsibility here.
Yeah, I really, try to do my research, and it was so nice to have those files, organized for me. And then I could also do research on top of that. So we did reference a lot of historical photos. And I used knowledge that I already had about Shumatch, which are just north toward the Tongva community, and sort of our cousins. So there's a lot of similarities, but then also a lot of differences in the regalia, and just what they would use. They were trade partners, but there are very distinct differences between the two tribes.
So now again, we've skipped forward to 1769. This is the first overland expedition on the way to San Diego to found the mission. So this is an expedition of soldiers and Franciscans. And I actually just have I've copied down the language here because I think it's so important. This is the missionary Juan Crespi, who kept a diary of the expedition. And he wrote of this encounter: as soon as they saw us, they ran to the hills and commenced a lot of shouting, seeming by their gesturing to be telling us, turn back. So again, this it counters the idea here, which is, I think, particularly objectionable in the case of California people, that they just sat back and took it. In fact, the Kumeyaay, who these are in the representation, revolted in 1775 and destroyed Mission San Diego. One of many violent reactions to colonization. So, and again, I think, Weshoyot's done really a marvelous job here of, with the costume. And I think, didn't we found a photograph or a graphic of Kumeyaay ceremonial dancers, I think, or some, but this is not just your imagination at work here, I think.
No, not at all. I've done my own research before taking this job on with early California, so it was in the back of my head, and I finally got to play a little bit with these images. But we definitely referenced dance regalia for the figures that you see in the upper right-hand side, and then there's a lot of material, like costumes and stuff for the Spanish soldiers that are actually still left in archives that you can review. So that was very helpful. For the bottom figures. But I also wanted to bring in just the landscapes in some of these. Like you'll see yucca here. And that's, a plant that you traditionally see here in Southern California, and something that we use not only for food, but also for clothing, for so many different things. And they're really considered, family members. They're our plant relatives. So I wanted to include those here. And I think it's kind of a strong statement too, to be able to include, the natural California landscape. That was something that was really interesting to me in these depictions as well.
So, Weshoyot, can I ask what you sort of, I don't know, what your sort of experience do like engaging so deeply with these histories, some of which are sort of, we know that had really serious consequences historically, and I don't know, what was it like to sort of spend that much time over them?
Being able to interpret them in my own sort of vision, I guess, was really empowering, I felt. However, they are difficult scenes to do. And, I've spoken about my family's history and my genealogy before, and I recognize myself as a Tongva individual. My mother's Scottish, but in that Tongva family line on my father's side, we also have Spanish soldier blood. So I have a mix of not only the native, community, but also the colonizer. So I think very heavily on those things when I'm doing these pieces, to where it's not one-sided. It's not necessarily in the vein of just the natives against, the Spanish invaders. You really have to think about what's going on in the minds of both sides. And it does take you down a rabbit hole. So I do get into a lot of really deep thought processes when I'm doing these images. However, being able to put something like this out there where it's empowering towards the Native community and showing them in a different light than they've been shown previously, especially in an illustrated historical context like this, where younger children are going to be able to read it, maybe middle school, is really, what I'm focusing on. Because I didn't have this sort of representation growing up. We had sort of the Spanish soldiers being glorified in any of the historical texts or information that they were, feeding to us. And so often the Native people were either just not represented at all because they had no materials, or they were misrepresented and shown as very primitive people, very savage, and just fitting into stereotypes that are really demeaning to all of the different communities. So, if I can have the opportunity to sort of reset that type of narrative, I'm more than happy to do it, and it feels good to do, but it can't always be one-sided. You have to think about all of the different sides of things. And just like my heritage, like I have all these different sides to it, so I really have to take that into account with representing other people historically.
They came out so wonderfully.
We might want to jump ahead a couple, so we
Yeah, I guess we should.
got a lot of time to cover here.
Here's another. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we should get. Please, jump in if there's a sort of particular.
Well, I can say we could talk about each of these.
Right, we could talk through the whole book. Yeah.
But this is a particularly interesting one because of the interesting. If you go back to that one, Josh, yeah, this is what 1818. So we're into Spanish California during the decade of the Revolution, the independence struggles, and a privateer from Argentina, Hipólito Bouchard, invaded Monterey. And first he gave them a chance to join the revolution, and the Spanish governor declined. And so he told them he was coming ashore and he was going to sack the town, and he did. But his crew was from all over the world, and he had provisioned in the Hawaiian Islands, and he had 80 Hawaiian warriors on board. Called them Sandwich Islanders, of course. They were in the van of the invasion, and then they took Monterey and chased the Spanish colonists out. They quickly burned the town and left. But again, it's just one of those examples of the unknown multicultural history of the state.
This one was, for me, really fun to do too, because as a kid, I think in middle school, I learned about Bouchard here in Ventura County, and they were actually supposed to ransack the mission. And so they ended up completely taking out all the valuables from the mission, hiding them away in the hills and hiding them away here and there. And then I guess he never made landfall here. He sort of just skipped on by, and I don't know what happened after that.
Well, he did stop at he stopped at San Juan Capistrano. They stopped there. He asked the missionaries if they could come ashore and fill their water kegs, and the missionaries declined. So he sent his men ashore and they sacked it, and they broke into the basement, and all of them got drunk on the Franciscans' wine. So yeah, it was. There are great stories here, yeah. And this is one of the things we had to do was decide, what is the illustrative moment that you're going to use to stand for a whole chapter, because there's one of these per chapter. They come at the beginning of the chapter, and they're to set the terms of the chapter in some way. So, there are lots of choices going on behind the scenes here, and how to turn this to our advantage. And now we're moving through, the California period here to the Mexican War. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, probably the most important California leader in 1846, was of course captured and imprisoned by the Bear Flag rebels. And this is that moment when they invade his house. He was still in bed. And so he's presented here as he was in his dressing gown and slippers. We had to find some kind of picture of a 19th century dressing gown, because Vallejo, of course, would not like to be portrayed in his dressing gown. But nevertheless, this was the moment that turned the conquest into a violent one. Because after he was imprisoned at Sutter's Fort in a dark dungeon for 3 or 4 months, there was no way that things were going to go well. And of course, Vallejo, ironically, was the California who was most in favor of American annexation. He advocated it with his fellows. What are we going to do? He said, well, we should think about joining the United States. So it took the supporter of that position, put him in jail, and lost his counsel. So it was a tragic moment.
I want to get to the point too where we can, maybe we scroll through this, but where we can kind of zoom out before we open it up to Q&A and talk about the idea of historical imagination that we talked about. I mean, we've kind of been touching on it in the particulars here, but this is great. All of these are so great and open up all of these stories, and I think that's kind of
that's the intention. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's one of the intentions. But so in our discussion before, we this term of historical imagination came up, and I think that's in the exhibition we're working on a lot of one of the themes the biggest theme is storytelling, and but one of the themes is a lot of these are retellings of history that we, whether it's a totally fictional movie or a more recent like this one, a lot of stories about the American West kind of draw on history, the stories that are most famous, and sort of what's your practice of historical imagination? I think this is a question each of you could probably answer in sort of different, and maybe not just about this book, but in your work more broadly.
I don't know who wants to go first.
You can go first.
Well, that's a loaded question. It's very vast, because I mean, I'm nowhere well versed in this material like Johnny is. I just recently managed to buy a collection of the original documents that had been translated by Bolton, which oftentimes are only available in research libraries. And I finally found 2 copies that I've been looking for the past like 4 or 5 years, so I can read those. And I'm sure Johnny's probably read all of those by now. But I really do try to access any primary source material that I can get my hands on, and especially for my own personal work, and then other work that I've done, in regards to a graphic novel I'm working on Tongva, who's our medicine woman who led a revolt against the San Gabriel mission in 1785. I've found the primary documents, but there's so much information that goes in between. Those primary documents were written by Spanish officials and translators, and so right off the bat, you're already going through a level of perhaps editing, but also a perspective that perhaps doesn't encompass all perspectives in the situation. And then so much of the historical narrative is written by men too. Oftentimes women aren't given the space to tell their own stories or their sides of things. And a lot of the historical narratives are written also by people that are in power, people that have the finances to do so, or, in many cases, the literacy. Not everybody was literate or could read and write. So you have to look at all of these sort of pieces to puzzles when you read historical materials and realize, what was going on during the time, but also perhaps the historical accounts that everybody uses may or may not be as truthful as you think that they are. So I think that's really where the historical imagination comes in. And in the work that I do, I really try to use the sensitivities that I have to sort of navigate those waters. And, I don't always get things right either, but I hope to perhaps tell more of a story on a human level, as opposed to maybe who's controlling the power and who's controlling the money in the stories that I work on. And outside of this particular illustration book, because these were very particular events, but when I'm writing the material and I'm drawing the material, that's kind of where my mind is going. Especially with Tongva, oftentimes it's not referenced that she was pregnant during the revolt and after, when she was imprisoned. A lot of accounts don't even make mention of it, or discuss what happened to her son afterwards. And like, as a mother with 2 children, I'm constantly thinking about that, because that's what my world sort of revolves around. So I guess I take that sensitivity into play in telling her story for that particular project, or putting my brain into what it must have felt like to be imprisoned with the Conestoga massacre, and another graphic novel that I worked on called Ghost River. So I'm constantly, evaluating the psychological side of things, and the human elements of things and trying to put my mind in their headspace historically.
Yeah, well, the question of historical imagination is it's a big topic, as Weshoyot says, and it can go in a lot of directions. And there are, I'm a historian. I mean, that's a particular way of confronting the problem of historical imagination. We historians are addicts to the fact. I mean, we require evidence. Evidence is our way of trying to get at the truth of the past. There are other ways of trying to get at the truth of the past besides evidence-based history. The historical imagination can be cultivated through a variety of means. I mean, let me think another fact-based, but not historical-based, fact-based appreciation of the historic of history and a real fulcrum of a historical imagination for people. And that's genealogy. It's based on fact, but people, their imaginations go far beyond the fact when they imagine their grandmother or their grandmother's grandmother or their grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. And then suddenly you do that and you're back in the 16th century. You just a little compounding and you there's really, and I think from a long career as a teacher, one of the real problems that young people have with trying to fathom the past is that they know about the present and they're used to thinking about the future, but the past is very short and they don't have any depth there. They don't even know really what a human life is like in terms of the breadth and feeling of it and the expanse of it. To imagine 2, 3, 4, 5 human lives back in the past is very hard to do. And so a lot of the work is not just an appreciation of the evidence of the fact, but the spirit of trying to imagine the passage of time, the passage of generations, the fact that real living people, breathing, thinking, feeling, once walked where we are now, and now they're gone. But they had lives just as meaningful as we did. That's historical imagination, and it can be approached in a variety of ways. One of the exciting things for me about this project was, when Weshoyot and I were talking about working together, of course, I went on the internet and looked around, and I found a talk that she had given. I think it was at UCLA, am I right? On your project. And I was really intrigued by it and fascinated with it. Now, I can't work that way. I can't, because the project that I heard her talk about was a project of the imagination, a way of thinking about the relationship of people and their interactions. And I found it enormously helpful as I retreat back to my, scouring through the evidence to try to make an argument based on, on footnotes and bibliography. But this project gave us a chance, I think, to try to combine those two approaches with some of the restraints of fact and research, but also the unmapped boundaries of the imagination. And that was very exciting for me.
I started reading my 7-year-old, the Gombrich, A Little History of the World book at some point during COVID, and we didn't finish, but there is an image there that stuck with me where he described history as this deep well, and you trying to come up with the history of it is lighting a little piece of paper on fire and letting it drift slowly into the deep well, and you see just glimpses of the edges, and it gets smaller and smaller the further back you go, which I think is a powerful metaphor related to everything both of you are saying, I think, and part of it can be through kind of fictional, and maybe museums have a slightly different tack in terms of that imagination, because I think it does help with that sort of empathic sort of approach to the past, to imagine somebody holding whatever this object is in their hands, or building it, weaving it, something like that.
I think one of the places where Weshoyot and I came together is, at least in practical terms, was that both of us are interested in using research into past documents, say they're visual documents, as a way of informing imagination. You know, so you're not just off on a tangent without any mooring at all. You have some constraints based on what you can find that tether the imagination a little bit, that make it possible for it to move down in certain ways, but not in others. And you know, testing the limits of that from an artist's methodology and from a historian's methodology. Hopefully, you know, we try to find a place where you can sort of get to an agreement on that. But there are many forms of truth, and the historian, you know, the academic historian, is only an advocate for one of those forms. Other forms are also significant, culturally significant, and very important.
Weshoyot, did you want to add anything? It looked like you were about to say
something. Sorry, I'm not used to the unmute. I was going to say that, you know, access to museum archives, like, greatly can help too, having those material items where you can actually, you know, get information off of them, because they existed during that time. Whereas, you know, as Johnny was saying, these people have come and gone and they're in the ground now, but those items, you know, are representative of what their hands maybe manufactured during the time, whether they're baskets or whether they're, you know, say irons or something like that. So, you know, if I can inform my work by either visiting archives or getting my hands on materials that are from these eras that I'm, you know, working on or illustrating, that greatly informs the work that I do too. So I've really brought that into my kind of my wheelhouse in the last couple of years, as I see how it informs my artwork and also makes it a little bit stronger, but also rooted in like historical or archaeological fact, because there are things I can go back to and be like, this is what I'm referencing. So there, you know, it's reality based in that way. But yeah, I really respect, you know, the work that Johnny does as a historian. And I dabble in history. I don't consider myself a professional historian or genealogist at all. But I'm so fascinated by some of the things that come out of it. And, you know, the talk that he's discussing that I did for UCLA, they asked me to do that. And I had just found out this information, you know, very recently when I did that talk. And it was in the work that I was doing for Tokarina. I had just set out to tell her story. I didn't think that my family genealogy was going to be tied into it in any way, shape, or form at all. And, you know, of course, in doing the research and doing the genealogy and figuring out from mission records who was in certain locations in certain time periods, in certain months during the year, it started opening up this like much more vivid reality of, no, these people were alive in the same place and potentially touched the same things, or were, you know, imprisoned in the same holding cell, or, you know, who knows. So it made this sort of vastness of history and places into something very small. And, you know, when you visit the San Gabriel mission, you realize it's not really that big at all. And these people were there all at the same time. So it really kind of blows my mind, those sort of synchronicities. But, you know, I couldn't do the work that I do without documents, without the aid of either historical documents or physical and archaeological things. And, you know, I value the work that historians do too. And I'm grateful to be able to sort of put my artistic twist on those sorts of things.
Josh, before we go to Q&A, which I know is going to come up soon.
Sure.
Could we jump ahead to one of the images? As I would like to make a point about it.
There we are.
I just wanted to emphasize that, you know, since mostly we've been looking at men in these images, there are lots of women too. And this is a particularly interesting one. Levi Strauss, of course, the, you know, Levi's, San Francisco, original American blue jeans, hired only women. Why? Because he refused to hire Chinese, the only other people he could employ so cheaply. He would not, in fact, the leather patch on the back of the jeans used to say, the only jeans made with all white labor. So these young women in 1890 went out on strike. San Francisco unions did not organize women workers in 1890. So it was a wildcat strike. They went out on their own in response to a wage cut. And the strike leader, I think her name was Lulu Lindsay, spoke up and negotiated for them. And Levi Strauss rescinded the wage cut. Now, 2 weeks later, they fired Lulu Lindsay and her other ringleaders, and they reinstated the wage cut. But nevertheless, it's a wonderful story and a reminder of the importance of women, not only in the household, but in the public world throughout California history. And it's something I took real pleasure in including in the book.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we should go to some of the questions and answers the questions from our guests. So if you have any, if you want to add some, please do add them in the Q&A box. So one kind of straightforward question here from Lindley Sims is, are the illustrations designed to introduce the chapter or suggest a theme for the chapter, or how do they function within the narrative?
Yeah, each chapter opens with the title of the chapter, and then comes the illustration on the same page, and then the text begins on the same page. So the opening page of the chapter, the title, illustration, and the beginning of the text. And sometimes the illustration starts right at the beginning of the chapter. Sometimes it comes later in the chapter, but the intention is to set the theme, yes, for the chapter.
Okay, great, thank you. And another specific question on the image, and Rob, I don't know if you could pull this up, but the image of the missionaries in 1769 and the Kumeyaay folks, it asks, is the second person from the right in a spotted dance shirt, or does he have smallpox or scars from smallpox?
No, he doesn't have smallpox. Huh?
Oh,
no.
Okay.
No, it's I'm not sure if it's tattooing or paint or.
I believe it was paint, yeah, from the photographic reference. And it always doesn't come through, but yeah, that they would actually, there's photographic documentation of them using sort of body paint, and I'm not quite sure what the materials were that they did, but they would do sort of different spots, and then different techniques in the weaving and stuff that they were wearing. But yeah, definitely not smallpox.
Okay. Then there's a couple related to the relationship of this history to school standards, educational standards. So one, David Eisenberg asks, what grade levels are you aiming for? How does this meet with the California framework? And how do you recommend any changes for the framework? And then Rita Bouchard asks, how does this history of California transcend the current traditional materials commonly used in fourth grade history and social studies?
Well, to be candid about it, I think probably the level of reading is a little advanced for fourth grade. It's not intended for fourth grade. This would more be intended for AP high school American history, that kind of audience. I think the target, certainly when I was reading it, the target audience in my mind was something like 16 to 30. So it would be junior high school, college, and the general reader. The dirty secret about what they call YA is that most of it is purchased and read by older adults. So that was the intention. I've been trying to follow the framework. That is to say, I'm trying to familiarize myself with the framework. In fact, this is an ancient conflict in California. It's been arguing about standards for history for the last 30 years. And in fact, it plays a role in the book. I talk about the standards in one of the later chapters. But I'm not familiar enough to know exactly what the framework calls for at this point. hopefully fourth grade students are not still doing the mission project, but they probably are some places. I know if the craft stores had anything to say about it, they're going to continue that project forever. But
yeah, I would say that they're definitely making changes in the curriculum right now, but I don't think that they have been completely implemented across the board. I know that there's a lot of changes happening, but it's a matter of getting all of the schools sort of to follow those things, and then also providing, you know, indigenous or native perspectives on some of these things too, to fill in those gaps. So I know that there's a large kind of a push for the Indian education to get more funding, so then they can also hire in more living Native Americans to sort of provide engagement for, you know, the fourth grade on up. So it's in the works, but it's not definitely not perfect yet.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about collaborations and about Imagine Wests. And so someone asks, can you tell us more about Imagine West, and will we get to see some of Weshoyot's illustrations there? And I mean, from my side, I said we're still working out the details, but I think the idea is to intersect with some of your work, particularly on Toyperina and some other important figures in Tongva history, in a section about California, Southern California specifically, in that within the exhibition, and stories about Southern California. And there are some Tongva women who haven't been, who haven't had their stories told, or who have had them told in ways that are not directly from the community. And so we're hoping to sort of share some of those stories. I don't know if you would like to add anything, Weshoyot.
Yeah, for those asking, it's not going to be my, you know, traditional illustration work. I do believe that the Autry is using sort of a photo illustration collage that I did, that people have seen, the Tongva land, where it's a reinterpretation of the Hollywood land sign, because it is on our traditional territory. And you know, that can open up tremendous conversation in a lot of ways. But yeah, the installation that I'm working on collaboratively with my aunt and with Craig, it's sort of a retelling and an honoring of specific Tongva women within our community historically that have had their stories told, but oftentimes not from our community at all. So Toyperina is one of them. The Lone Woman of San Nicolas Island is another. Doing this collaborative installation for this particular, you know, exhibit is sort of paralleling a lot of work that I'm doing personally on both of those women. I recently kind of put a thing on my Instagram that I was going to start a project on the Lone Woman, and it's been sort of a long time, a project in the back of my head. So yeah, my 10-year goal plan, that'll be something else that'll be out there, and maybe the Autry can, you know, further support that. But
I certainly hope so. And then Lillian Wilson asked, Weshoyot, your illustrations are perfect for this project. Indeed, I'm curious about your family's reaction to your drawings. If there was something you learned about your family history because of the project that surprised you.
For this particular book, I don't know what my family thinks. I think I produce so many things, and I have my hands wrapped up in so many projects that it's oftentimes a little difficult for me to sort of inform them all on what it is that I'm working on. It's not until the project actually comes out and they can hold it in their hands and they're like, oh, that's that thing you were talking about. So yeah, I just put my nose to the grindstone a lot of the time when I'm working on these, and my family doesn't actually see it until it comes out and I pass around comps. But this particular project, you know, it just allowed me to work in areas that my family had been engaged in California history. And so that was kind of exciting for me.
And I guess just following on the question, I guess I'm supposed to sort of start to wrap up here, but because it is 4:58. But I do want to sort of, well, I guess I should just sort of wrap it up and say that just thank you both for sharing these great stories. I'm so excited to see this book in our gift shop next year, and to see Weshoyot's work in however we kind of develop that within Imagine West later this year. And Johnny, hopefully we'll have you out once travel is more effective or possible for these kinds of events.
I'll look forward to that.
Southern California. And I want to thank you all for coming to this event about this history that these two have created and are can't wait to see it in print, and historical imagination more broadly. And so hopefully you've enjoyed this, and please check back soon at the autry.org for /artist salons for upcoming programs that we plan to have. But once again, thank you, Weshoyot Alvitre and Johnny Faragher. I really enjoyed speaking with you both and learning so much.
Thank you very much, Josh.
And Steve Aaron says, so
Thank
excited to see you both at the opening of Imagine West in December. So I guess that's an invitation from our incoming CEO. So, all right.
Well, thank you again so much.